All right, so no new numbers out of Alberta again, obviously being the weekend. And I'm also pretty soon probably just going to stop talking about the whole numbers thing because it's kind of tedious at this point. There's no reason to lock down. I mean, unless things would have to get infinitely times worse than it is now to even have to worry about locking down. Again, people are talking about how there's one hospital in Alberta that's at capacity and people are all paranoid, but the reality is that there's literally hundreds of hospitals in Alberta. So the idea that we need to be all worried about, I mean, it is one of the bigger ones, but it's one hospital. Like, come on, people, it's insane. And not only that, too, and you look at some of these states, like New York wasn't even overloaded, and they're the hardest hit area in North America. Like they brought in that extra hospital, they built it, and they didn't even need it. They had an extra hospital in Florida. They don't even need it. So the idea that we need to be worried is beyond insane. Again, the numbers out of the states are down a little bit from yesterday, both the cases and the deaths, but both are still relatively high. But again, the deaths is the number you really need to be worried about. But it was lower, so that's good news. Um, the main thing to talk about here is another piece of evidence pointing towards the numbers being inflated, and this is something that's been joked about, at least in the more the anti-lockdown crowd, which is probably most of the people watching this video. It's something that's constantly joked about how, man dies in car accident or man hit by bus, marked as dying from the virus. And yet we have an example of that in Florida man who died in motorcycle crash listed among the virus deaths. And people say, well, if for anyone who doesn't know, well, how did they get away with that? Well, the reality is that um, a guy like this would have had the virus. He probably would have been asymptomatic, considering I'm assuming he was a younger guy. I mean, there's not a lot of 80-year-old men driving around on motorbikes. It's almost all young men. So he probably had it. He was probably asymptomatic, and they obviously would have tested him when they're at the hospital or at the wherever, and they found out that he has it. And because the government, I mean, there's clearly somewhat of a conspiracy going on, which means, yeah, he would have been marked as dying from the virus, or at the very least, he would have been included in the case totals. And again, this is just more evidence that the numbers are completely doctored. And even with the way the numbers look being doctored, it's still not bad. The death rate for people under the age of like 50 is still less than the flu, and for the really young people, it's much less. And again, the other thing too to point out too is that the flu. I mean, there is a vaccine for the flu that is arguably effective. I mean, most of the time it's not effective. I mean, the flu shot's kind of pointless to get, I guess, is the reality of it. There's no real point in getting it because they rarely actually guess the right strain, and there is downsides to taking vaccines as well. So but the main point being is that, again, I've made video after video mentioning this kind of stuff, and I don't understand why people are still so apt to believe that this still being paranoid. Um, and again, the one thing that the way I'm rather sure that I'm right about the idea that the numbers are rather inflated. I mean, number one, a lot of places have admitted it, and why I think I'm right that there is a bit of a conspiracy going on here is that I've yet to see an example of an area that is underestimated or underreported numbers. I've never seen any examples of that, but there's literally, I can give off several examples off the top of my head of places that have overestimated either the deaths total and or the flat out test positive rate. And given that we know that data, we know that stuff has gone on again in multiple states. It's gone on in Toronto. It's gone on in Pennsylvania. It's gone on in Florida. It's gone on in Texas. I mean, again, that's just a handful of places just off the top of my head that I know. I'm sure I could find more if I looked into it. But the point being is that there's no examples on the other end of the stick, which means it's almost guaranteed that there is a concerted effort to make this whole virus situation appear worse than it actually is. That's clearly and blatantly obvious at this point, especially given the fact that the governments are still taking it so seriously. Like the reality is that for people under the age of like 50 to 60, they hardly should even have even heard about this whole thing. Like we should have been open since probably we should have been open for 3 months already. Life should be pretty much back to normal, aside from the people that are at risk. I mean, there should be maybe some smaller precautions taken as far as sanitation and cleaning goes, but a lot of these buildings are they're still fairly clean. I mean, depending on the one, but I guess the whole point being is that for most people, life should be back to normal. And by back to normal, I mean they shouldn't even hardly notice a difference. But because people are all paranoid and the government wants to capitalize on, again, it's the whole never let a good crisis go to waste scenario. So the government wants to capitalize on that. I mean, look at the Trudeau government. Look at they pushed through the gun ban, which hopefully won't get through. I mean, they've tried this whole we scandal thing. Like, look at all the corruption and garbage. Even in Alberta, the UCP have pushed through some pretty crazy stuff. So um, yeah, the whole point being is that it's the never let a good crisis go to waste, and they're going to keep pushing until they can get away with more and more and more until people finally wake up. So anyway, and no, again, this is something that I pointed out before, but so California has re-shut down. I don't know if it's the whole state, but I think the big cities at the very least. And again, this was something that was in early June. We're literally talking about 100,000, maybe even more people, literally gathering shoulder to shoulder, and nobody cared. Obviously, because it was for Black Lives Matter. I mean, at the time, I was up in arms, but again, we are at the point to we're back at the point to where gathering is now a terrible thing again because Black Lives Matter's kind of lost its luster to a degree. A lot of people have woke up to the fact that they're largely just the Black Lives Matter has been largely taken over by communists who want to defund the police and implement communism. Um, so again, it's lost the luster, and now we're back at if you want to reopen, you're the worst thing in the world. Florida and Texas and these states they've only been hit hard because of they've been reopened. But even though again, Florida's literally been open. Florida was open for like 2 months before the outbreak happened. Again, the incubation period's like a 1 to 2 weeks. So the idea that it had anything to do with it doesn't even come close to matching up. Like it's almost like these people don't even understand basic math. Like incubation period 2 to 3 weeks. Florida opened for 2 months before. Again, like there's literally over a month lag time in there. Like come on. Like I don't understand how people can be so stupid. But the reality is that people will make up whatever lies they have to make up to satisfy their worldview, and they'll accuse the other side of doing that too. But we have the facts on our side. The reality is that they're, like I say, within a week. Well, I guess a better way of putting it is that within about a 6 week period, we went from protests being the worst thing in the world. If you want to go out in public, you're the worst person in the world. You should be fined, possibly even arrested, to everybody should be going out in public, assuming it's Black Lives Matter. Gatherings of tens of thousands of people, perfectly fine, to where now we're back at if you want to open your small business, you want people to die. And again, and the other thing too is that they're the same people that were arguing, like in April and May, that the virus disproportionately affects black people. Like how stupid can you guys be? Now they're right about that, but the reality is that they don't tell you is that blacks are just more likely to be unhealthy in the first place, which obviously means they're going to be more affected. If the more unhealthy you are, the more likely you are to be affected. Like it's um, my guess is that would explain the entirety of the difference. And given the fact that they don't throw that caveat out there, that's probably the case. But anyway, again, it's just absolute sheer and utter craziness that's going on. This is from Dennis Muller on Twitter, and he says, again, obviously referring to the Trudeau we scandal, and he says, if Canadians stop paying their income tax, would I'm sorry be acceptable? And again, we live in a standard where there's different sets of rules for different people, and I've been railing against this the entire time I've been making videos. And when I talk to most people, um, at least in the general public, they could care less. They think it's a good thing. And then stuff like this happens and they're shocked and appalled. And I think to myself over and over again, like literally, like how stupid can you guys possibly be? It's the same thing with all these idiot leftists and NDP supporters in Alberta. Like they support a big, giant, massive government, but yet they're shocked and appalled when the UCP or any government for that matter would abuse that power. Like, they're shocked and appalled. Like, again, like, could you guys be any stupider? Like, could you be any stupider? The reality is that they like the big government as long as it's their team in power, right? I don't like the big government no matter which team is in power. And again, the way that you know that they have no idea what they're talking about is that they just project their own worldview onto other people. Um, Again, that's kind of the way you know they have no idea what they're talking about, and they have literally no ability to empathize and to see what it's like from the conservatives' worldview. Now, they will throw out that same accusation, but the numbers clearly back up. And again, I've made videos about this, so there's really no debate on it. The numbers clearly back up the idea that leftists are a heck of a lot more likely to not expose themselves to views that differ from their own. Again, the stats are very clear on that. So anyway, the last thing I wanted to bring up here is again from Derek Sloan, who honestly I'm starting to feel better about. If he wins the leadership race, I would probably support the guy and support the conservatives. But for starters, that's probably unlikely. And the other caveat is you never know what could happen in a general election. You know, it's always the strategy of, people in politics that when you're in the party elections, that you go to the left or you go to the right to try and gather more support, because there's no worries, like you're not losing support of people on the left because they're not voting for you anyway. And then in a general election you move more to the center. That's kind of the general strategy, which most of the time people don't follow that, but that's kind of the general way of going about it. Now, if he's talking very good on a lot of things. He's big on free speech. He wants to get rid of this stupid gun control garbage. um, he wants to withdraw from the carbon tax. He wants to defund the WHO. Again, those are all things that need to be done. And honestly, those are all things that don't differ from the PPC that much. They don't differ that much. So, I mean, they definitely do a little bit, but again, if he can get elected, um, I would probably support, because again, you never know what's going to happen. Like I say, he could start pandering to the left to try and gain approval like Scheer did, but Scheer wasn't even as good as Sloan is at this point either. But Sloan's actually, I would say, somewhat comparable to Maxime Bernier. I don't think he's quite as outspoken. I like that Maxime Bernier is more outspoken. The problem is that that makes him a lot more susceptible to attacks from the left, which is why Bernier is so hated. Sloan's a little more under the radar, but still somewhat outspoken. But again, nonetheless, it's just something I wanted to bring up because I've seen a lot of things from him that are really encouraging, like really encouraging. The problem is, again, I don't know if they're going to be able to get enough support to get Trudeau voted out. Like, I really don't. They'll sweep Alberta and Saskatchewan again. They'll get parts of Manitoba, parts of Ontario, but the problem is that they're not going to get the GTA, they're not going to get any of Quebec, and they're probably not going to get any of the Maritimes. And they need to get at least a decent amount of that if they're going to win. So, and that's the problem. So, anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about today. If you like the video, make sure to hit that like and subscribe if you haven't already. Check out my PayPal and email. I got linked in the description. Again, appreciate any donations, but at the very least, just hit that like and subscribe if you haven't already. And last few things, check me out on Twitter, Parlay, and BitChute if you haven't already. But make sure you check me out on those if you have not.